It's my pleasure to speak after my friend and colleague Pablo, and it's also my honor to speak after Joseph Stiglitz. SUERF and Michaela proposed to me to speak not about climate change, but we'll come back to that, but to another possible tragedy, which is linked to public debt and which you suggest to call tragedy on the horizon. And I will come back to this slight difference. Can I start saying a very simple thing, that obviously we have entered uncharted territory for economic outlook and our economic policies in the past 8 months. But however, one danger is certainly looming larger at the moment, our lasting addiction to public debt. Let me be clear. In the face of this unprecedented COVID shock, a massive and one-off recourse to public debt financing was both inevitable and fully desirable, no doubt about that. However, we have entered this crisis in many of our countries with public debt levels which were already very high, with some notable exceptions. In his famous 2015 speech, Mark Carney spoke of climate change as the tragedy of the horizon. With this, he meant that this tragedy is inevitable if we do not act, but it is in the long term, possibly leading to a status quo bias. Public debt is of a somewhat different nature. We do not know if nor when the tragedy, for instance, a major confidence shock, may happen. But we know for sure that rising public debt is a growing risk hanging over us and still more over our children and grandchildren. Let us therefore call it a tragedy on the horizon, a moving horizon. Indeed, nobody knows precisely where geographically the horizon lies, but it will not be any less threatening. So what would our best response to this possible tragedy on the horizon be, and what can we do to avoid it? Let me elaborate somewhat on a very simple triptych, Michaela. A, monetary policy, B, fiscal policy, and C, their renewed interactions. I start with monetary policy. In order to address this unprecedented COVID crisis, the ECB, as you know, acted boldly and rapidly, using all the tools at our disposal and even inventing new ones, such as our PEP. By doing so, we successfully avoided both deflation and fragmentation. We rightly decided to keep a steady hand in the last Governing Council meeting. And I still think today that our present very accommodative monetary stance is appropriate. But steady hands are not tied hands. We have free hands for the future and will be ready to act further if needed. Let me now turn to a more structural issue, which is the ECB strategic review, on which work, as you know, has restarted. It will be more extensive than the Fed's one, as it will cover, among many things, structural changes, climate change, yes, financial stability, and the effects of digitalization. The Eurosystem will take its time, as the Fed did, to consider the different alternatives till September 21. But we can already today shed some light on 3 key points. First point, a dual mandate like the Fed and the ECB's 2-tiered mandate are actually more similar than they look. Second, there is some room for clarification in our inflation objective. And third, we should, according to me, look again at the second pillar of the ECB and its possible link with the so-called secondary objectives. Let me elaborate somewhat on these 3 points. On our mandate, it puts a clear priority on price stability. and hence it is not a dual mandate. But neither it is a merely single one. I would characterize it as a two-tiered mandate that includes at least two other objectives without prejudice to price stability. On the one hand, and I quote the treaty, to support the general economic policies in the Union, contributing, among other aims, to, I quote again, a social market economy aiming at full employment, yes, and social progress, unquote. And on the other hand, to safeguard the stability of the financial system. On our inflation objective, and the inflation objective, and this is a point where there has been probably more discussion after the Fed's review. Can I say that average inflation targeting is a flexible tactic, possibly temporary, within a wider strategy of keeping inflation sustainably where expected. But still more importantly, our inflation objective has to be symmetric and medium term. As regards symmetry, I cannot do better than quoting Christine Lagarde in her impressive speech of this ECB Watchers Conference. I quote, "In the current environment of lower inflation," and I stress the lower compared to 2003 and our previous strategic review. "In the current environment of lower inflation, to underpin inflation expectations, we need to ensure that our aim is perceived to be symmetric by the public." End of quotation. I personally add that we might therefore be willing to accept inflation higher than 2% for some time without mechanically triggering a tightening of our monetary stance. And medium term, it means that we should judge our inflation performance over a long enough period. As I said on previous occasions, our medium-term target needs to be viewed in two ways. It has to be forward-looking to guide inflation expectations, but it cannot ignore the past either. If credibly, I stress the credibly, symmetric and medium term, our inflation objective would probably achieve similar outcomes ex post than ex ante explicit average inflation targeting. And some words, as I said, on our second pillar, the present monetary analysis. Some say we should suppress it. I rather think we need to rethink it in light of financial stability concerns. And to do so, we could, according to me, track a broader set of nominal aggregates, financial aggregates, on the one hand, from the perspective of financial stability, which means potentially look more closely at the assets of financial institutions, including non-banks, such as the provision of credit in the broadest sense, rather than at the liabilities only, including money as in the past. Financial aggregates, but other economic aggregates as well, starting with nominal GDP and its growth, which is a key metric in the assessment of private and public debt sustainability, but also employment and income distribution, which respond to the demands of the treaties as well as to the expectations of the broad public. Let me now turn to fiscal policy. Of course, we should not repeat the mistakes of the last crisis and tighten the fiscal taps too quickly. This is what Pablo precisely said about avoiding cliff effects. But let us be clear. The public debt pile, which has risen sharply, will need to be paid back eventually. And to do so, which is a frequently asked question, and the topic of this conference, three combined levers will have to support the necessary debt reduction strategy. Time plus growth plus better control of public spending. We will first need time in order not to phase out fiscal accommodation too early and not repeat the mistake of 2011 and 12. We should resume the debt ratio reduction after growth returns to its pre-crisis level, probably after 2022. But fiscal policy cannot simply be counter-cyclical in bad times. The same thinking needs to be applied, we should stress it, in better times as well, when they will come. Growth. It's indeed a key determinant in financing the debt inherited from this crisis. And this brings us to the debate initiated early last year by Olivier Blanchard. First, the best way to ensure that the famous differential between the interest rates and the growth rate, R minus G, remains negative, and this negativity is not granted forever nor everywhere. The best way to keep it negative is to increase G, obviously. And hence, let us listen to the balanced message of Blanchard. I quote him, "Public debt is bad, but not catastrophic. It can be used, but it should be used right." Unfortunately, this element, the right, the quality and the content of public spending is too often the blind spot in the fiscal debate. In August, Mario Draghi quietly coined the telling expression of good debt. Expenditure should be used for productive purposes and for young people, education and training, research, which have a strong impact on potential growth, on long-term growth. On the contrary, we know that fiscal transfers have a much weaker multiplier in the long run. And I mentioned a third ingredient, better control of public spending. Unfortunately, in many countries, including somewhat the one I know best, we have not managed to keep spending under control. Let me also be clear here. COVID-19 related public spending is clearly the buffer mechanism that the economy needs in the current circumstances. But there are also less warranted expenditures, and this is precisely what we must focus on, since the pace of extra COVID spending seems in several countries to be accelerating even more quickly than before the virus crisis. To conclude on fiscal policy, and broadly speaking, the recipe for debt reduction depends on each country's own speciality. Some countries need above all to boost productivity growth, others need to control their public spending. But they have one ingredient in common, efficient reforms, and we shouldn't forget about them, even in crisis times. I now come to my last part about the interaction between monetary policy and fiscal policy. In the current context, I stress it again, both monetary and fiscal expansion are indispensable to sustain demand and inflation and to mitigate the costs of the crisis. However, given the unprecedented rise in public debt and extremely low or negative interest rates, some could be tempted by the seductive lure of fiscal dominance, a situation in which the central bank in the future would have to follow another objective than ours, namely the financing of public debt. This paradigm shift could jeopardize our independence and our mandate. Ultimately, it could lead to a loss of confidence in the value of the money, as observed in the past. Additionally, in the euro area, having a single monetary authority and 19 national fiscal authorities, we are all aware of that, creates further challenges in the absence of coordination among member states on their budget. This is why risk sharing across the euro area should not rely only on fiscal mechanisms, but also on private markets by completing the capital market union. And here we all agree in the Governing Council, as Pablo also reminded us, we should at end walk our talk and deliver. In the short term, obviously, the risk of fiscal dominance is not an issue. Today, monetary and fiscal objectives are fully aligned and require expansionary policies from both sides. Fiscal policy can even help monetary policy to achieve its inflation objective by boosting demand. Firms and households are encouraged to borrow in such an environment, which allows them to benefit fully from the monetary stimulus. And conversely, monetary policy can also render fiscal policy more effective. The dominant view is indeed that fiscal policy becomes more effective at the effective lower bound because monetary policy is less likely to react to offset the effects of fiscal policy. So this is in the short term. However, conflicts of objectives between fiscal and monetary policies may arise in the future. On the one hand, large fiscal stimuli for too long may lead to concerns about debt sustainability and via the expectations of future fiscal tightening, offsetting the favorable effects on output and inflation. And on the side of central banks, low inflation today is not a guarantee that it will remain low forever. Hence, central banks must keep a sound balance sheet with adequate capital in order to keep full control of their monetary stance along the road. The key question is, and this is our question today, is then how to reconcile the benefits of a mutual reinforcement of monetary policy and fiscal policy in the short term with the challenges of keeping inflation under control and public debt to sustainable levels in the long term. There is no magic answer to this question, but can I try to sketch some basic principles that are, in my opinion, ingredients of a sound policy mix recipe. First, each authority should be guided by and stick to its mandate. The Maastricht Treaty includes strong safeguards against fiscal dominance by granting independence to the euro system, introducing the monetary financing prohibition, and designing some fiscal rules. These are not negotiable principles. Inflation should remain under the control of an independent monetary authority, while fiscal authorities are in charge of the provision of public goods and income distribution, under the condition of debt sustainability. For this, it is necessary to preserve as much as possible the credibility of the fiscal rules framework. In other words, I wouldn't jump today to a hasty revision of the Stability and Growth Pact. Second possible ingredient, monetary and fiscal authorities should take into account the intertemporal consequences of each other's actions. This means that the central bank should only adopt measures that can be implemented if inflation presses or the risk of a de-anchoring of inflation expectations materialize. Fiscal authorities instead must ensure that public debt will converge to a sustainable path in the long term, even if interest rates return to higher equilibrium levels in the future. And fiscal authorities must hopefully improve the quality of fiscal expansions by favoring spending that enhance future long-term growth. These requirements of quality is especially true at present for the European and national recovery funds. And again, I think we all agree in the Governing Council about that. Fiscal authorities should follow a stronger counter-cyclical fiscal policy in good times to create the space that is necessary in bad times. What Blanchard and Summers call semi-automatic stabilizers, stabilizing fiscal policies that operate according to predefined triggers, could be an avenue worth exploring. I come to my conclusion. Let me add for that against this backdrop, the next generation EU package constitutes a new and innovative element of the European fiscal framework. A very positive step which contributes to the sounder policy mix I mentioned. Beyond the most recent political and institutional discussions this day, which belong to elected leaders and not to us, can I stress that a quick, complete implementation of this European Recovery Fund is an economic must. This innovation, while still a one-off, could also imply lessons for our economic and monetary union, which from the start has lacked a permanent fiscal capacity at supranational level for macroeconomic stabilization in deep crisis. Either we succeed in designing at end credible and coordinated counter-cyclical rules for national fiscal policies, or we should think about some central fiscal capacity, reversible in its use, controllable in its size, but effective through the cycle. This could be one area of discussion in the European momentum which the crisis has initiated. And thank you very much for your attention.